I'm a professor at the University of East Anglia, and I used to be the Green Party MEP for the East of England from 2019 to the time when we left at the beginning of 2020. And I'm going to talk today about energy security and gas prices. While I was an MEP, I got very interested in questions about how the East of England might be brought to net zero on energy in particular by 2030. And so I commissioned a report on that. And that led me to have a particular interest in issues surrounding renewables. And the gas price and energy crisis that we've been seeing over the last year or two has various repercussions in terms of how we relate to the future of energy in this country and in Europe. The price of energy bills has been going up, as everybody will know. In May the 15th this year, it was said that UK households are paying £1.1 billion more for energy bills than they were before Brexit. So some of that is due to the post-Brexit trading arrangements. So they calculated that £370 million is due to the inefficiency of the way in which we buy and sell power from interconnected cables with our European partners. That was much easier before Brexit. But then £700 million extra on the bills is due to the higher carbon prices in the emissions trading scheme that we've set up in the UK. So to replace the EU emissions trading scheme that we were in before, we've had to invent an emissions trading scheme of our own, and that's pushed up the price because the carbon prices are higher in the UK one than in the EU one. So what is an emissions trading scheme? This is a way in which they try to control or reduce emissions by auctioning the allowances for harmful greenhouse gas emissions. That starts with some emissions that are free, and after that, if you're going to make more emissions than your free allowance, you have to pay for them. You have to, as it were, buy them in the auction, and the price rises with greater demand for emissions allowances. So it goes up if people are using a lot. There's a cap then on how many are up for auction, with the aim of the cap being to bring down emissions by making them costly, and that causes it to be beneficial to firms and industries and so on to reduce their consumption, which is our way of trying to reduce the emissions towards a target of achieving net zero in due course. So capping how many are available prevents people from just carrying on emitting as many greenhouse gases as they want. So as I said, it's more expensive here. The UK auctions for emissions are more expensive than in the EU. Now you might think, oh, well, that's a bad thing because it's pushing up our bills. But then on the other hand, you might say, well, maybe it's good that they're more expensive here. That's perhaps part of how we can actually make some progress towards cutting emissions. If buying an allowance of emissions is particularly high priced and rather low priced in the EU, maybe the EU is not going to manage to get its conversion to renewables going as quickly as we would. So this could be an incentive to move in the direction of lower emissions, which would be beneficial in many ways in which we're going to look at in due course. There is a mechanism to stop the price going too high. There's a limit on how high it will go. So I'm not sure whether that's a good thing. Why should we cap the price when actually we want it to be expensive to be allowed to emit greenhouse gases? That should be priced quite high because it's very damaging to the environment. But on the other hand, I can see why they cap the price, because obviously they don't suddenly want bills shooting through the roof for energy. We all suffer if that happens, and they don't want the bills for industry here to be so exorbitant that they can't actually continue to engage in production here. And then another question about whether this is working well is the reduction that they've got on the cap to move it down towards the net zero target. Is it anywhere near good enough? As far as I can see, it appears that they're aiming to reduce the UK emissions allowances from what it was in 2021, which was 155,671,581 tons. So this is the cut from 155 million to 117 million in 2030. That's nowhere near zero. That's a tiny reduction. So it seems as if you're not actually achieving very much that way. And then we might ask about the effect that having this kind of auction has on offshoring our emissions, because if all you're doing is buying emissions that you can emit in this country, and that's very expensive, then most production will get moved to countries where emissions are not expensive, where they don't have a scheme like this. So that will actually move the use of energy to somewhere else, but doesn't mean that we're not using that energy to make the things that we want to do. So for industry, this is actually an incentive to just produce the goods elsewhere. One of the factors in this whole energy price rise crisis is obviously the war in Ukraine. It really started before that. The prices of petrol, for example, you'll remember, were shooting up before that. But then there was a sudden crisis, especially in Europe, when the war in Ukraine started, because then they needed to put sanctions on Russia and not be feeding Russia money with which it would buy weapons, with which it would attack Ukraine, with which we would respond with weapons, which is obviously a ridiculous circle. So they had to stop the supply of money to Russia, but Europe was pouring money into Russia because it was addicted to oil and gas that was supplied from Russian pipelines. So that had to be cut off. So that caused the EU to up its game immensely. It raised the ambitions of the European Green Deal. They wanted suddenly to find replacements for all the Russian oil and gas that they had been simply drawing from a pipeline, pouring money into Russia in return for an endless supply of energy. So because that's suddenly brought home the fact that Europe in general was wholly dependent upon Russia, this made everybody realize, not just in the EU, but also in the UK, that energy security is actually part of national security. If you're dependent upon your enemy for fuel, they can quickly cut you off and you'll be in a serious difficulty, which is effectively part of what we were facing, a serious difficulty that led to escalating prices and shortages. So did the UK have a Green Deal strategy? Did we have any way of moving towards more energy security and especially green energy that would be free of all these fossil fuel dependencies? Because it's not just Russia, it's our dependence on Middle Eastern countries as well, which has in the past also been problematic if we're trying to import oil from countries that we actually should be sanctioning. We had David Cameron deciding to cut the green crap, as he said, which was supposed to be saving us money, but it was actually causing us to pay over £150 a year more for each household for our power than we should have been if he hadn't eliminated the funding that was supporting renewables. So that decision to withdraw funding for the renewables, it was ending onshore wind projects. So they've been more or less completely forbidden since then. It cut the subsidies for solar installations, eliminating the feed-in tariffs that made solar pay back its cost for homeowners. So it stopped people from putting solar panels on their roofs. and it ended the energy efficiency schemes that were aimed at reducing demand. So we had a whole stalling of all the progress that had been previously being made towards converting ourselves to renewables and making ourselves more energy self-sufficient. So, and then of course we'd fallen into this incredibly chaotic post-Brexit thing, which wasn't a strategy at all. There was no plan for how Britain was going to leave the EU, and there was no strategy for anything other than the idea of removing all the red tape, including environmental protections. And at that time, the EU hadn't made much progress with decarbonising energy either. So we opted out just at the point at which the EU was beginning to get its act together on this. And in 2020, when these problems started to emerge, our government was already scrabbling about how to cope with being out of the EU and how to cope with COVID, and it didn't have its eye on energy at all. So one good outcome of COVID was that Johnson had a reason to promote something that he actually did believe in, which was cycling and walking, and making more space for pedestrians and less space for cars. At the time, there were few car journeys, people weren't traveling a lot. People were asked to take exercise outdoors, and several measures were taken to promote more active travel. Massive subsidies were also provided for public transport at the time because there was a huge reduction in journeys on public transport, so ticket prices couldn't cover the costs. So that initiated a period at which public transport was subsidized. And we also had a new awareness of the importance of fresh air, the health risks of air pollution, early deaths from air pollution, and so on. So there was a bit of renewed awareness that was a sort of byproduct of COVID, and some action to improve access to open spaces and active travel. One of the most effective measures to reduce fossil fuel dependence is to increase the use of public transport, to get people out of private cars and into public transport so that you're not using fuel or electricity for every single vehicle for every single person, but you put people into mass transit and it's much more efficient. But unfortunately, COVID had the effect of driving people away from their habitual use of buses and trains. They tended to go back to private cars or else onto bicycles. And so there was actually a move away from public transport, even though public transport was being subsidized. And then we had the energy crisis hit. The petrol prices shot through the roof. There were also fuel shortages. You'll remember the queues at the petrol stations and so on. That was partly due to Brexit, partly due to a lack of lorry drivers. So we needed more public transport and less driving, but public transport had lost a lot of its people. So how to respond to the energy crisis in those circumstances when you'd had no strategy for it here? Brexit had taken us out of the EU, so we didn't benefit from their strategy. What do you do? Here's some things about what happened in Germany. Germany focused on transferring people from private cars to public transport. So they invented a thing called the 9 for 90 ticket. For €9 a month, you could go anywhere in Germany on the local and regional railways and buses. And they did that for 3 months from June to August 2022. This was a huge success in a certain way. Over 52 million tickets were sold. 1 billion journeys were taken on public transport. 15% of those journeys were people new to using public transport, and 10% of them, now I think that's a bit of a disappointing figure, but 10% of them replaced what would otherwise have been car journeys. So it saved more than 4 million car journeys, and it saved 1.8 million tons of carbon emissions. But that was a 3-month period when they had these ultra cheap tickets, and the effect didn't last after the ticket ended. And the scheme cost 2.5 billion euros in subsidies. And another thing that it showed up in the process was that much more investment is needed for this kind of mass transfer to public transport to be sustainable. It needed additional trains, more staff, more infrastructure to carry more passengers, it was struggling to cope. So it was kind of an interesting experiment. It kind of showed what that sort of scheme doesn't quite do, but it also showed what we would need to do to make it work. They're now repeating that scheme at a less generous level, but with this simple one ticket to go anywhere. And it's now 49 euros a month, which is really pretty affordable to go anywhere you like in Germany, any number of times, many times a day, as many trips as you like every day. And it's the simplicity, the ease of having a ticket that means you can just get on public transport any old time. Of course, it would be even better if it were free, but 49 euros a month seems to be being quite popular. So that was one particular European country, which obviously has Greens in government, so they're particularly keen to do various things that are beneficial, though it was primarily addressed at the energy crisis to reduce demand. The other thing is the European Green Deal, which is EU-wide. This is a bill which went through the European Parliament while I was there. It's a set of policies designed to reduce the carbon emissions of EU countries by at least 55% by 2030 and to net zero by 2050. These ambitions are actually insufficient for the climate crisis, but at least it's a strategy of sorts, and it covers climate, energy, transport, and taxation policies. And the aim of this Green Deal is to reduce emissions, to create jobs and growth, to address energy poverty, to reduce external energy dependency. So this is the national security issue, that you don't want to be dependent on others for your energy supply, and also to improve the health and well-being of Europeans. Creating jobs is one thing. Creating growth, of course, is potentially problematic because there's never been any way in which growth can be decoupled from carbon emissions. And it's highly unlikely that the European Green Deal can decouple growth from carbon emissions. So that old-fashioned growth ambition is probably a foolish one, and is part of the lack of ambition that it has. But nevertheless, it is a strategy. Just a little side about zero emissions cars. So the European Green Deal claims that it'll deliver a 55% reduction of emissions from cars by 2030, a 50% reduction of emissions from vans by 2030, and zero emissions from new cars by 2035. It seems to me that you can't have zero emissions from new cars by 2035 unless you have zero emissions from energy production from electricity by 2035, which they're not going to achieve. So there's clearly an error there. To deliver zero emissions in use, of course, to deliver zero emissions as you're driving from the tailpipe is one thing. You're not making any emissions, but you've got to have zero emissions energy to charge the battery for it to be a zero emissions from a car. So there's also no such thing as a zero emissions production process for a new car. So it appears to me that the EU Green Deal, much like the UK government, confuses a vehicle that has zero emissions from the tailpipe with a vehicle that has a zero carbon footprint in use or in production. And that clearly needs to be rethought, because you can't just think that you're going to get a reduction in emissions of this kind of level by counting the emissions that are coming out of the tailpipe, which may be zero. And in any case, because of the need for electricity to be powering other things such as heating, we really need a proper transport strategy that moves away from private cars towards mass transit and cycling and walking and so on, and away from an economy that produces and markets new vehicles and towards other kinds of productivity. So the main carbon footprint of a vehicle is in production, and the Green Deal for the EU is currently advocating increasing this market and production by increasing the market and production of electric vehicles. But the electric vehicle production industry is not a green industry. Obviously, electric vehicle buses and e-bikes and so on are, in that they move people from a high carbon use to something much less, and avoid them keeping on buying new cars. But electric vehicle production is extremely carbon intensive and also currently involves lithium batteries, which are problematic. There are some good bits in the EU Green Deal. So one thing is that from 2026, road transport will be covered by emissions trading. So that'll put a price on pollution, reinvesting in clean technology, stimulating cleaner fuel use. I've highlighted stimulating cleaner fuel use here, and we'll come back to that in a moment. It's also proposing carbon pricing for the aviation sector. That used to be exempt, which was an appalling omission because aviation is one of the worst things for climate change because the emissions at altitude are particularly problematic. However, here again, I've highlighted this mention of sustainable aviation fuels and the obligation for planes to take on sustainable blended fuels for departures from EU airports. So this is again some of this sort of greenwash stuff, which suggests that biofuels are a good substitute and that you can carry on doing the thing but pretend that it's green. You've still got high altitude emissions if you use biofuels, so this is still a problem for aviation, and biofuels are not a real solution because they still emit greenhouse gases and they're just taking up production on land that should be producing food and using it to burn to produce carbon emissions. They will not be charging proper emissions trading charges for biofuels, and this is a serious problem. The Commission also proposes to extend carbon pricing to the maritime sector. So this is also a good thing, to charge emissions costs from shipping, and they've also put in rules to say that the major ports have to serve vessels with a power supply from onshore, so you can have green electricity supplied to the vessels while they're in port, rather than have the vessel run a diesel generator to power the ship while it's in port. The EU has some soft power and can influence the rest of the world too, so that's a great advantage of the EU Green Deal, that it adds carbon prices to imports as well, so that they're not competing in unfair competition with the EU. So you put rules on the EU, you have regulations and a carbon price, and then you impose the same carbon price on external countries that are exporting to the EU. So in that way, you impose the same pricing beyond the EU. That's part of the value of the EU as a powerful trading bloc. So then one aspect of the Green Deal is addressing fuel poverty. There's a social climate fund that's to support EU citizens at risk of poverty by energy for homes or mobility. So this is about the just transition, a fair transition to clean energy that leaves no one behind. There's quite a lot of renovation of buildings to reduce fuel poverty. In addition to homes, public buildings must also be renovated to use more renewable energy and to be more energy efficient. And so here are some regulations for the member states. They have to renovate at least 3% of the total floor area of all public buildings annually. So this is to improve energy efficiency, set a benchmark of 49% of renewables in buildings by 2030. So this is renewable energy to power the heating and lighting for the buildings. So heating needs, and also cooling, so this will be air conditioning, will have to be done by renewable energy at an increasing rate. Doesn't sound like a lot, but at least it's something. So I've said at the bottom here, these are inadequate. I mean, these targets are inadequate and slightly ill-conceived in certain respects, but if only we still had this, because this is so much better than we're likely to get while we have our current government. So in the EU, there's also a policy on restoring nature and protecting and restoring forests, peat bogs, etc., and an acknowledgement that biofuels can be a fake solution and that it's better to take carbon out of the atmosphere using natural solutions. That was the Green Deal that was from before the energy crisis. And then, of course, the energy crisis has caused the EU to up its game considerably. And this Repower EU, the Joint European Action for More Affordable and Secure and Sustainable Energy, which went through in 2022, this is the action that was addressing the need to get off Russian oil and gas more rapidly than they had envisaged when they passed the Green Deal. So there are two pillars to this. One is diversifying gas supplies, and so this is importing fossil fuels from non-Russian suppliers, and also renewable in the sense of biomethane. So this is biogas to replace natural gas. So that is continuing to burn fuels that produce greenhouse gases, but just getting them from somewhere else, not Russia. And then the other is the better policy, but you can see why they felt they needed both because of the urgency of the situation. And so this is reducing the use of fossil fuels in homes, buildings, industry, the power system, and so on, by boosting energy efficiency. So this is insulation and retrofitting, increasing renewables and electrification, and addressing infrastructure bottlenecks. So that's facilitating the conversion of energy sources and so on to renewables. The first of those pillars just transfers to other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but the second is a good long-term solution. And, you know, they've been incentivized to do it. And they also issued a toolbox in October 2021 to help member states to help people through the crisis because it was urgent. So they allowed countries to do a number of measures that would previously have been outlawed by EU law. So they were allowed to give emergency income support to households, they were allowed to do state aid for companies, and they were allowed to do targeted tax reductions. And they took a number of other measures. And it's worth noticing here that this reaction to the rocketing prices removes one of the supposed Brexit benefits that we were supposed to have, that we can suddenly do state aid and income support and so on, that would have been not available to us while in the EU. Now instead we have the EU doing just that, allowing it and even providing money towards it, so we miss out on the money as well. And then there's a question of decoupling gas and electricity prices. So it was the price of gas that rose dramatically after COVID, and then even more so with the sanctions on Russia. Drilling for oil and gas doesn't cost any more than it did before. It's a price rise that is due to scarcity, not a price rise due to increasing costs of producing it. This means that those who are extracting the oil and gas are getting very much higher prices than they used to for a process that costs exactly the same as it did before, or only tiny amount more, insofar as they're also having to pay the higher prices. And the other problem is that electricity prices were and are coupled to gas prices, but the electricity produced from renewables is generated at a fraction of the cost of that from gas-powered power stations at the high price, and indeed a fraction of the cost of that that is produced from nuclear power stations. So we all have to pay electricity prices that are as if all the electricity that we were buying was from gas. And so the more the gas goes up, the more the electricity price goes up. In this way, but for both gas and electricity, energy companies were being paid far more than it was costing them to generate the energy or to supply the gas. So energy companies were making vast profits, while suppliers and customers paid sky-high prices for the fuel and power. The coupling of the electricity price was a problem because it meant electricity went up as well. The gas prices were a problem because those using that fuel were also paying high prices. Why do we pay gas prices for electricity? It seems as if renewables should be priced to be more desirable, especially if they are more desirable environmentally and they cost less. So that's what we want, and we want to pay the price they actually cost, not the price that it would cost if they were from gas. Many people in the UK believed a myth that electricity prices were in fact pushed up by funding for renewables. But in fact, they were pushed up by the cost of fossil fuels. They would have been much, much cheaper if they were all from renewables. It's only because we still buy some of our electricity from gas-powered stations that our electricity costs a lot. It would cost virtually nothing if it was all from renewables. But there are problems. If we cut the price of renewables, that would reduce the amount that those companies who are investing in renewables have to invest. And we need more wind and more solar. So it's a good thing that those companies have a lot of money to invest, because that's the way at the moment that we invest in renewables. We encourage people to invest in renewables. It's going to yield them a huge profit because they can sell the electricity at this huge price. So it's well worthwhile them doing so. So that is an incentive to do it. But you might think, well, I don't know whether that's really the best way to run the system. Is this the right way to prioritize infrastructure investment by charging ordinary individual people too much so they can't afford any energy and they're freezing to death in their houses, so that their money that they would have paid for the gas, only they can't afford it, or they would have paid for the electricity, can fund renewables? Why not have a proper strategy of investing in the renewables that this country needs, done as a national industry, that we actually need it for security, for our energy security, and it delivers massively better and affordable energy. So why not pay for it from the money from the Treasury? It's a vital part of our infrastructure. We shouldn't be charging the very poor to make those investments. So this is a slide that explains about auctions for electricity. I don't think I've got time to go into this, but you can see on the graph that renewables are right down on the left. They're very, very cheap. But supposing that they can supply this amount of energy, but the energy demand that we need goes up towards the right of the graph, you'll see that after a certain point, we're going to have to use coal, which is cheaper than gas. And then eventually we're going to have to use gas. Now, in this country, we don't do much coal except in emergencies because we've primarily tried to turn off the coal-powered stations, but in Europe they have a number of coal-powered stations. Those are producing much cheaper electricity than the gas, especially when there isn't availability of gas. So you can see that the lack of renewables causes us to use coal and natural gas to generate our electricity, and that pushes the price up, and the price is set, as you can see, at the top of the natural gas price. And that's what we're going to end up paying as soon as we have to use any gas-powered power. And we will have to use some gas-powered power because we haven't got enough renewables. Renewables have very low or even zero marginal costs. But as long as some gas-fired power stations are required to meet the demand, then the price will be set by the gas price. So in the energy crisis, there were various stopgap solutions. One type was to put a price cap on and to subsidize the electricity beyond the price cap. Another is the windfall tax type of solution. And you'll see that on the right of this graph, of this visual, there is the UK, its electricity generator levy that was put on rather late in the day, but eventually they were brought to put on a generator levy. And this is the windfall tax that takes back a bit of the profits from the energy companies to restore the value back to the Treasury. This was needed partly because the UK was pouring money into subsidies. The Liz Truss solution that crashed the economy was a way of capping the price of fuel, pouring public money from the Treasury into the already huge profits of the fossil fuel extraction industry by paying part of the price of the energy for us. Such subsidies are hugely inflationary, and they need to be matched by a corresponding windfall tax to return the extra money that's going to the companies and going into shareholder distribution, which coming straight out of borrowing needs to be returned so that the borrowing can be kept under control. But the UK's windfall tax had special loopholes for companies to claim that they were investing in new fossil fuel mining, and then they were allowed to pay less of the windfall tax. So that was a clear loophole that allowed them to do more of what they shouldn't be doing and to get a tax benefit from it. It was incompatible with our climate crisis Paris Agreement commitments, and it was incompatible with a sustainable future for the planet. and it was incapable of helping with the domestic energy prices because the mines are privately owned, and then the gas and oil that they extract would be marketed at world prices, and global prices still, if the global prices are high, then it won't reduce our prices at all. It looks as though Truss was in some way committed to fossil fuel expansion. She tried to end the use of onshore solar farms and so on. She wanted to clear out quite a lot of the renewables. So she was going in the opposite direction of what we needed to go in order to reduce the price of our energy. Now, today's news tells us that Rishi Sunak says that the green levies will return from July. In fact, it's being attributed to Rishi Sunak as though it was his decision. But the reason for this is that the green levies were being paid by the Treasury. That's part of Liz Truss's move, that she didn't want us to pay green levies on our fuel bills. So she transferred it all to the Treasury. So it was done out of government borrowing. And that was to happen until the energy prices returned to a sustainable level that we would be able to afford again. And the reason why the levies are to return from July is that the bills are coming down, the cost of gas has decreased, and so the point at which the levies return has been reached. Rishi Sunak says that these levies reduce our bills. But since the bills are linked to gas prices and not to renewables, they're not actually at the moment reducing our bills, because we still pay the bills as if we were buying everything from gas and not from renewables. It's not clear that the green levies are the best way of funding investment in renewables and energy reduction. Here are some questions. Should the investment in renewables actually be paid for by public funding for investment instead of adding to people's energy bills? Because in a way, it's still the people paying for it if you pay for it out of some kind of taxation. But the taxation can be more fairly distributed so that it's not hitting those in energy poverty as well as those who can afford to pay. It's true that the return of the levies will not push bills up, but the bills will still fall. So we will still see falling bills, not rising bills, even though the green levies have returned. And you might think that actually there's some sense in having the green levies because higher bills discourage excessive use of energy. Of course, it would be quite nice if you could do it on excessive use of energy, not ordinary people's basic heating. But the more renewables we can get, the closer we'll get to being able to decouple the prices and give people the cost of energy at the cost it actually takes for renewables. So here are a few thoughts about how you could decouple. It's very difficult. You can extend the revenue cap systems, the windfall taxes and so on. You can have some things called contracts for difference and power purchase agreements, but they're very complicated. And the third option, which the UK is quite kind of interested in, is dividing the market into two categories, where you can get cheaper energy if you go for the renewables, but there's a risk of variability if you go for that. But it's complicated to allow the consumer to choose their mix of energy. So here are my thoughts on what it would be to have real progress on energy prices and energy security. It seems to me that the first priority should be a focus on reduction in demand, not increase in supply. The more we have high energy requirements and dependence on risky supplies, then the more this is a threat to national security. So we are vulnerable when we have high energy requirements. So the obvious way to make ourselves less vulnerable is to reduce our energy requirements. Second priority would be to focus on a transition to safe, clean energy that's within our own territory, the kind of energy that is not a target for air raids in the event of future warfare and terrorism. So secure provision of diversified renewables across the country in various locations, and the grid to support that. And we should be putting a high priority on low-cost mechanical storage solutions for renewable power to terminate the myth that renewables are intermittent, variable, unsafe, etc. Because it's a myth. If we'd put anything like the kind of investment into that we put into drilling for fossil fuels or building nuclear power stations, we would have ample storage to cover when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. So those are the sort of 4 top priorities. We need to cut free of fossil fuels. We need to do these things in order to be completely free of fossil fuels so that we can get our price down to the renewables price. Then I've got a few other thoughts about ending the confusion about electric vehicles, which actually pushes up the demand, not reducing it. And we should stop talking about net zero and aim for net negative, because we've got historic emissions that we need to draw out of the atmosphere, not just limit what we're putting in.